Commission and Secretary, Department of Atomic Energy. Our esteemed speakers of the session, Dr. Frank O'Sullivan, the Director, MIT Energy Initiative, USA. This is MIT's hub for energy research, education, and outreach. Our other eminent speaker, Mr. Sandeep Pondrik, the Joint Secretary, Refineries, Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas. Dr. David H. Turpin, President, University of Alberta, Canada, a public research university which is located at Edmonton. Dr. Turpin himself is one of Canada's most admired post-secondary leaders. Joining us also Mr. M.K. Surana, the Chairman and Managing Director of HPCL, the state-owned oil and natural gas company. Dr. V.K. Saraswat, Member Niti Aayog, a key scientist in the development of Prithvi missile and the former Director General of DRDO. Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General TERI. He's also the member of the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change and the former Director General of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Also joining us, Mr. Sumant Sinha, the CEO of Renew Power Ventures Private Limited, which is India's leading solar and wind power company. And also requesting our knowledge partner, Mr. Namit Sharma from McKinsey, to please join us here. Can I once again request all our speakers to please be on the stage? And all the people who are standing in front of the stage, a very humble request, sir. We are ready to start the session. A request to the photographers, we are ready to start the session. Please, can I request the people in front of the stage to please clear out that space, please? The structure of this session remains the same as the earlier ones. Our knowledge partner is going to be setting the tone and the context of the session with the theme presentation. This is then going to be followed by the opening remarks of the Honorable Chair of the session, and then our eminent speakers are going to be addressing us in this session. The Q&A, we take it at the end. Please pen down your questions, hand it over to our representatives. We take it at the end, your questions. So I now request Mr. Namit Sharma from McKinsey for the theme presentation. Thank you.
No, I think it was already on the thing. On my computer, not on. Can we plug in? Yeah, we can plug in your computer. So can you give me a pen drive? Sorry? Possible to view it on USB? I don't have a USB. So. We have we got the okay.
Good morning, everyone. Well, there seems to be some technical problems, so I'm going to give it a try to talk without the presentation being uploaded. My name is Namit Sharma. I'm a partner from McKinsey & Company. I just wanted to frame this session on beyond fossil fuels by giving a perspective on global energy demand and supply, and where do we see it going over the next 30 or so years. So let's start with the demand. So in McKinsey, we actually spent a lot of time and research on trying to figure out what is the global energy demand is going to be longer term, and do a very granular analysis across countries, sectors, and fuel to understand it. When we updated our analysis for last year in 2016, we saw 3 structural shifts in global demand. The first of all was, I think it's working now, so I'm just going to move over there. So as I said, we saw 3 fundamental shifts in energy demand driver. The first of all was that the global GDP growth is depressed over the coming decades due to aging population. By 2040, it's expected that 1 out of every 4 people will be above 65 years old in developed economies in China. The second one, it's also quite important, is that the shape of the GDP growth changes. There's a shift towards services. So the growth, the industrialization growth that we saw from China over the last couple of decades is unlikely to be replicated, as more of the growth in the coming 30, 40 years is going to be driven by services, which by definition are less energy intensive. The third one, which I think we all know, but we continue to get more energy efficient, and this trend is going to continue over the next 20 to 40 years. In fact, when we actually came out with our latest forecast last year for global energy demand till 2050, we are the most bearish outlook across all similar outlooks available outside, with the Shell, IEA, or Exxon, or even Greenpeace reference. And most of this growth is actually going to come from non-OECD countries, while India and China driving most of the growth in the next 20 years, and India driving bulk of the energy demand growth 2035 onwards. Now let's have a look at the supply. And let's take all the fuels one by one. Let's start with coal. Well, as we can see that coal will actually peak and decline over the course of next 30, 40 years, mainly as climate change agreements and the discussions actually lead to less coal being operated in power generation in a lot of geographies, and new investments coming slower. On the oil side, we see the oil growth flattening over the next 40 years. Oil is an interesting one, of course, given that there's a natural decline of 3%, even a 0.4% growth can actually mean an aggregate growth of 3 to 4%, which is fairly respectable. But let's just look a little bit deeper into oil. This is a complex chart. I don't want to get into the detail for the chart, but I think I would like to point out 3 numbers for us to understand. First of all, we see in oil the total demand growth from 2014 to 2035 of around 12.6 million barrels a day. But there are 2 sectors that are actually quite interesting. The first one is light vehicles. We already see oil demand growth peaking in light vehicles before 2025. And as you can see, most of the oil demand growth is coming from the chemical sector, which is accounting for more than 60 to 70% of the growth in oil. So what we tried to do was a thought experiment: can oil demand growth peak in the coming 15 to 20 years? And if actually we change the assumptions a little bit, for example, if we assume that in 2035, 25% of all plastics consumed are recycled versus 9% today globally. By the way, this number for India is 60%. So it's anyways not a stretch for global community to get to 25%. And the second one is we have 5% more efficient plastic packaging that reduces the demand for plastics. And 37% of the new cars sold in 2025 are EVX versus 27% today. We could actually see oil demand peaking anywhere between 2025 to 2030, which of course has multiple implications also for geopolitics. Coming back to our supply mix, we had a session on gas just before this, but we continue to see gas growth strongest amongst all fossil fuels, growing at around 1.2% per annum over the next 20 to 30 years. A lot of reasons behind it. People are touting gas as the transition fuel, as a bridge fuel, as we get to renewables, but also seen as the most cleanest source of power among fossils. However, most of the growth in energy supply sources is coming from non-fossil renewable sources. Having said that, I think it's also interesting to note, if you still look at 2070, 70% plus of the energy supply is going to come from fossil fuels, while the rest is coming from non-fossil. However, there is a lot of growth in non-fossil given what the capacity is today. So why is non-fossil growing too much? Well, two reasons. First of all, we see a large growth in electrification throughout the economies. Electricity demand in final demand is going to outpace the other final demand by a factor of 2. Most of that is actually driven by India and China, around 75%, due to increased electrifications in buildings and industries, but also in transport in the longer term. And then, of course, that results in, with the continued, I think, pressure on the climate change and the other agreements between the country, we see, plus, by the way, the cost of the renewable sources going down, we see the strongest growth in renewable sources by a factor of 4 or 5 versus other fossil fuels. So just want to leave you with 3 messages before I get other speakers to make their presentation. So I think in terms of overall global energy demand, we see that the energy demand is decelerating, and we believe the downgrade is structural with fundamentals changing underneath it. Oil demand is flattening. The question is there a peak in sight within the next decade or so? Growth is in electricity and renewables. Thank you very much. I'd like to pass on.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. Dear colleagues on the panel and distinguished participants. Well, first of all, let me welcome all of you on my behalf and on behalf of all my colleagues on the panel to this session, for which we have an excellent backgrounder presented by Mr. Sharma just now. I'll reserve my comments towards the end of the session, and so without losing time, may I request Mr. Frank Sullivan to make his presentation.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and Anna, thank you very much for your framing remarks. Mr. PowerPoint, that's Rock. He's having a tough day. So let me begin by saying thank you very much to Petrotech for the invitation to be here, and I think particularly for the opportunity to speak about the emergence of renewables in the context of the rapidly evolving picture we see for oil and for natural gas. The previous session was extremely helpful, I think, in framing what is today a remarkably rapidly changing landscape for natural gas globally. And what I'm about to speak about now, the energy transition and the growth of renewables, is actually intimately linked to gas, and we'll speak about that a little bit in my remarks. So, you know, not to overstate a point that has been made several times already, but the energy sector is facing a range of challenges. At the most fundamental, I think, are the challenges of supply and demand. I think supply is relatively robust, certainly globally, but the demand and the appetite for energy is vociferous. There are 1.2 million people in this world without any access to electricity, for example, and over the coming several decades, those demands for energy services are going to have to be met, and they're going to have to be met in the context, certainly, of climate change and the need to adjust our fuel mix to meet that, the challenges that flow from climate change. I think one that's particularly important in the Indian context is changes in water resource availability, food demands and the pressure between food and bioenergy production and so on, and of course geopolitics. So this all comes together into a complex milieu that I suppose boils up to what many people broadly consider the climate challenge. The graphic that I'm showing here, and we won't spend too much time on my graphics, I think they're just a crutch for my remarks. But this graphic is more or less laying out what our pathways forward, what our choices are going forward in terms of emissions profiles. And from a business as usual case, the top graph, and then a few other opportunities. So the center line, the COP21 or the INDCs that most nations have bought into, as you can see, relatively speaking, represents a flattening of emissions over the next 70 or 80 years. To get to a 2-degree target, we would have to have a very, very significant decline in emissions. I think all of these targets are very challenging. But on the bottom, what I just want to point out is that if we look at the sectors of the economy that are going to have to react first, and that are likely going to have to react in the most dramatic sense to any attempt to mitigate CO2 emissions, for example, the big player is going to be the electricity sector. And in the electricity sector, we're going to have to see, even to meet COP21 targets, a profound change over the next 20 or 25 years. So that's a significant transition towards gas and a very, very significant ramp up in the role for renewables. So we have this changing balance in the conventional sense with the rise of gas, and then we have this dramatic new surge from renewables. I like to say now that that solar and wind, they are no longer green technologies, different technologies. They are at energy's big table. They just happen to be very low carbon technologies. And if we reflect on what we've seen in terms of investment and capacity rollout globally over the past decade, for example, you see exactly that. 40%, actually more than 40% of all the capacity, generation capacity that was installed globally over the past decade has been in the form of either wind or solar, okay? And broadly spread across the world. Now, wind was in the vanguard, but we're seeing a transition today towards solar, and I think for the next period, solar is going to take over that mantle as the most prolific renewable. And looking at that, you can see that even in terms of short-term projections, here on the left we just have the latest IEA assessment of what renewable capacity we'll see built over the next 5 years. And we're going to see as much solar built as we're going to see wind. And that's going to be more than we already have installed. So, you know, this dramatic rollout. Now, in the case of India, India has, of course, laid out some very, very aggressive targets for renewables. And if we just look at what we're likely to see, we're going to see very significant solar and wind rollout over the next 5 years, on the order of 100 gigawatts. Now that does pale in reality in significance to more conventional assets, but it's still a very, very serious step. And again, I think it representative of the fact that solar and wind now are real options. They're receiving a significant amount of policy support here, of course, but increasingly their economics are going to help drive and accelerate this trend as well. So a little bit on the economics and why we've seen such a profound acceleration in deployment of these technologies. So this graphic is just illustrating how solar PPAs, power purchase agreements in the United States, how their prices have evolved over the course of the past decade. And in the United States today, large utilities are regularly procuring long-term solar power for less than $40 per megawatt hour. And in the United States, even with our abundance of shale gas, a long-term fuel volatility-free contract at $40 per megawatt hour is very attractive. And that has really, really been an important factor in the adoption that we've experienced, particularly at the utility scale. So in the US, we have a lot of rooftop deployment and so on. Much of that is much more linked to policy. But at the utility scale, solar in particular now is really beginning to stand up on its own 2 feet. Our new president-elect, Donald Trump, has made certain comments with respect to renewables and so on and their supports. If you actually speak to folks in the market in the United States today, very few people are actually worried that there's going to be a significant impact to renewables in the United States at scale in the new Trump administration, simply because of where the economics are. And internationally, the story is even rosier potentially. Here in this graphic, we just have the past few years, the trend in PPA prices and how things have, in the past year in particular, taken a very significant step down in cost. There have been a number of particularly low PPAs signed in 2016. By the way, I should add, these particular PPAs are without subsidy. And the idea that you can get to $30 or $40 per megawatt hour in any market today without subsidy with these renewables really does speak to the competitiveness of large-scale solar. In the Indian context, I think the potential for even more economic solar in India is very strong. What we've seen from the PPAs being signed in India is that they tend to be a little bit on the high side relative to some of these other international benchmarks. But again, I think over the next few years, as we see this acceleration in the Indian market, those numbers are going to improve significantly. Now, that's all a very rosy picture. But I need to stress that we may be jumping the gun with respect to the notion that wind and solar are here and easily integratable and so on. In reality, these resources today really represent a marginal contribution in our power systems. And going forward in the next 15, 20, 30 years, if the growth rates that people are projecting are going to manifest, then things are going to change. These technologies are going to become a much larger contributor as an energy fraction to overall energy supply, and that's going to challenge both their economics and their technical integration. And I just want to speak about that for a little bit. So this is a rather complex image, but what it is doing is just illustrating how the wind and the solar resource in Texas varies every day, or did vary at least every day in 2014. And really the point here is that when you have a resource like this, which is not dispatchable, really, you have to think much more carefully about how we design our power markets to integrate these types of technologies effectively, and how we think about the technical aspects of the power system, the backup that's required and so on, to ensure that the reliable power supply we've grown used to can be maintained. One of the most profound challenges for this larger scale future for renewables, and particularly solar, is an issue known as value factor decline. And I'm going to just briefly speak about it because it is fundamental actually, and we're seeing it in a number of markets today, and it's going to be important for the future of these resources. Basically, most of our power systems run on the principle that we dispatch our lowest cost assets, and that the peaks are generally met by more expensive assets, gas turbines, for example. That sets a price, and that price represents rent for lower cost assets, and that's how we pay for the system, and that's been the case for many, many years. Now, the problem with a lot of renewables is that these are zero marginal cost resources, and solar in particular is a zero marginal cost resource that generates in the middle of the day, typically when demand is highest and when prices were highest. So by introducing significant amounts of solar onto the system, you actually meaningfully alter how prices are formed. Prices fall very significantly in some cases once you reach moderate penetration levels. And that pricing and that collapse of pricing in some markets leads to competitive challenges for solar itself, but also for every other asset on the system. Because all of the other assets on the system rely on the high prices in the middle of the day in order to pay down their capital. And I should stress, this is not a theoretical issue. This is happening today in many markets. One of the prime examples is in Germany. This graphic illustrates exactly that point. Those lines there, those traces, represent how a typical wholesale market price, and normalized, I should stress, evolved over the course of a day in 2006, right the way up to 2012 in Germany. You'll see that in 2006, in the middle of the day, power prices were very high in Germany. That's because of the paradigm that I was just describing previously. But between 2006 and 2012, the Germans rolled out a very significant amount of solar PV. A lot of production in the middle of the day led to price suppression in the middle of the day. And today, the average price in the middle of the day in Germany is actually lower than the average price for the overall day. And this has caused untold challenges to the German utility sector. So one moment and I'll wrap. This issue, this challenge of value decline and the management of value decline, coupled with the management of intermittent renewables and intermittent output from these assets, is going to be the big challenge going forward for these larger scale integrations. We're doing a lot of work at this at MIT and so on. Here's some work that we've done from our recent Future of Solar study, which I would suggest you all take a look at. We can manage this. India, as India looks to introduce and integrate a lot of solar, will be able to manage this effectively. But ultimately, what it requires is a very thoughtful coming together of technical expertise, commercial expertise, and the regulation to make it all work. Or otherwise, this kind of transition to a more renewables-heavy future could indeed be quite challenging. And with that, I'll stop. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. May I now move to the next speaker, Mr. Sandeep Poundrik.
Speech by my previous speaker, Dr. Frank Sullivan, on solar predominantly, or solar and wind. Now I would like to speak on biofuels, which are not so much into news, but which we think are equally important in the renewable sector. And when we say that beyond fossil fuels, they have a very, very deep they will have a deep impact on the renewables. So starting with India at a glance, India, we have about 18% of the world's population, third largest economy, growing at a CAGR of more than 7%, likely to grow at more than 7 to 8% in coming future. And we are the third highest in energy consumption, with average energy consumption growth roughly 5%. And at present, the country is at a low per capita energy consumption of only 606. So there is a large potential of growth, and renewables can play a very, very important role in this, filling this gap of energy consumption. These are the key energy drivers. Population, as I said, we don't have any dearth of population. Then transportation mix, socio-economic factors, GDP growth, urbanization. India is rapidly urbanizing from a primarily agrarian economy to urbanized economy, and electricity capacity. There's a lot of electricity capacity. So these are the energy drivers which are going to impact the country. The energy landscape, there have been studies by BP as well as Niti Aayog or Planning Commission, erstwhile Planning Commission, and as you can see, as was shown in the previous presentation, that the main energy burden will be taken by coal and oil. Today, that is in 2015, they cover roughly 85%, which will come down to roughly 78% by 2042, but that still will be very high percentage. But one thing which you may note is that renewable will go from 2.2% to 9.8%. They are expected to grow from 2.2 to 9.8, and this is the growth story, this is the opportunity which we have to catch. And at the same time, the import dependence is likely to go down from 55% to 45%, but still it's an area of concern. And I am saying this because biofuels are one energy sector which will reduce the import dependence. And as you can see, the oil import dependence is reducing from 88 to 78, is likely to reduce, and one of the key factors in this is biofuels. So when we talk of renewable, the power sector, solar, wind, hydro, biomass has already been talked about. I will primarily focus on fuel sector, that is biofuels. And the goal has been set by our Honorable Prime Minister when last year in 2015 in the same hall during Urja Sangam, he gave us a task of reducing 10% import of oil by 2022. And renewables are part of this goal. When we make a strategy to achieve this goal, while 60% of this is by more production of oil, 20% roughly goes to renewable. So renewables are environment friendly, fossil fuel consumption is reduced, but one thing which other renewables may not have that much focus on is agricultural economy or farmers. As you all know that India is primarily still an agrarian economy, and renewables give a large impetus to farmers, extra income. And when we talk of biofuels, we will be talking about biodiesel, first generation ethanol and second generation ethanol. So coming to biodiesel, we consume about 87 billion liters of diesel in the country. Last year we consumed that. We consume about 3 times that of petrol or gasoline. And even if we have to blend 5%, we need about more than 4 billion liters of biodiesel, but our installed capacity as of now is only 1 billion. So there is a lot of space in this sector to have more biodiesel capacity. And we started in 2002 with some initiatives, some government programs, some policy changes. But till 2015, we were not able to do much in the sector of biodiesel. In 2015, the things changed. Government allowed bulk consumers to procure the biodiesel directly, and then retailing of biodiesel blended diesel also started. As of now, more than 3,000, about 3,500 petrol pumps are selling biodiesel blended diesel, and 45 million liters of biodiesel has been supplied to OMCs. But still, this is only 10% of the 4 billion figure we talked about in the previous slide. So we have to go a long way on biodiesel. Perhaps a more successful story is that of ethanol. We started in 2003, and from 2006 to 2011, at an average of about 200 million liters of ethanol every year, we were able to blend about 1 billion liters of ethanol. From 2011-12, things improved a bit. In 2013-14, we blended 300 million liters. But again in 2014-15, things became very positive. Government decided to offer an enhanced price to incentivize this sector, an enhanced price to ethanol, and also allowed second generation ethanol procurement. And the process of procurement for OMCs was made much simpler. And this graph primarily shows that how ethanol procurement in the country has improved over the years. From 380 million liters in 2011-12, this year we have crossed 1.1 billion liters of ethanol blending, the highest so far, and we are likely to continue this trend by government supporting policies and procurement by OMCs or oil marketing companies. Even with this slide basically shows what is our consumption demand of ethanol. So right now we are at a deficit of 1.8 billion liters of ethanol, which is likely to grow to 2.6 billion liters by 2022. And the molasses route which we are using right now is not likely to suffice to cater to this demand. And hence we come to second generation ethanol. In India, we have 120 to 150 million tons of surplus biomass which can be used for ethanol generation, and we talked of a figure of 4 billion liters, but we can generate 25 to 30 billion liters of ethanol if we are able to use this surplus biomass for ethanol generation. And government has asked public sector oil marketing companies to go in this direction, support this initiative, and install a few pilot plants so that we can have some examples of successful second generation bioethanol production facilities. And OMCs have agreed to this. They have given a commitment to give a 15-year offtake commitment to anybody who produces second generation bioethanol. They are also installing 12 plants at an average cost of $120 million each. So they will roughly invest about $1,400 million or $1.4 billion in this sector in coming 3 to 4 years. And in this Petrotech itself, tomorrow they are going to sign MOUs with some of the technology providers, some of the state governments for these second generation bioethanol plants. What are the challenges? The story is not that simple. So the challenges, as we talked yesterday, low crude oil prices give a very, very stiff competition to bioethanol, biodiesel. Then there are issues of supply chain and commercially viable technologies. The present technology is still the bioethanol cost from second generation is higher than molasses route, but we hope that as in case of solar, the scale will provide requisite impetus to this sector and the prices will come down, the cost will come down. While there are challenges, there are more opportunities in the sector. the policies are very supportive, and there is adequate agricultural residue in the country. There is assured market commitment given by the oil marketing companies, and more new technologies, both indigenous and international, are coming to in this sector. So to summarize, biofuels, in addition to solar and wind, are sustainable, environment friendly, and they have an extra advantage that they give an extra income to the farmers in the countries, and countries which have adequate feedstock like molasses or agricultural residue, they have a big advantage on biofuel sector. It reduces import bill, fossil fuel consumption, and many technologies are now, more and more technologies are coming in the sector to reduce the cost and make it more amenable. So to conclude, the goal, as I said, as per the task given by the Prime Minister, is to achieve 10% bioethanol and 5% biodiesel blending by 2022 in India, and similar stories may be repeated elsewhere. And I will end my presentation with this quote from Michelangelo, that the greater danger for most of us isn't that our aim is too high and that we will miss it, but that it is too low and we will reach it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pondrik. Let's move on, and may I now request Dr. David Turpin to make his presentation.
Well, thank you very much. As president of the University of Alberta, it is really my pleasure to be here in Delhi for the Petra Tech 2016 conference and to be part of this panel. I really wish to sincerely thank the organizers for inviting me. The University of Alberta's relationship with Petra Tech began almost a decade ago, and for many years our Center for International Business Studies has been honored to welcome a delegation of Petra Tech executives to our campus every year for an annual workshop on energy-related issues. The reason for this is the University of Alberta is the #1 university in Canada for energy-related research, and in fact, we rank #6 globally in energy-related publications. And it's based on this and building the strong connections and expanding the opportunities for partnership and collaboration between the University of Alberta and Petra Tech that I'm so very pleased to be here. Indeed, partnership and collaboration will be one of the central themes of my remarks today. Today's topic, alternative energy beyond fossil fuels, seems at first glance an unexpected choice for a conference devoted to the petroleum industry, an industry that we know will continue to play a vital role in the development of countries and communities around the globe for decades ahead. In my country, Canada is our largest, in our country, Canada, oil is our largest export, with oil revenues making up 13% of Canada's annual GDP. The industry employs over 900,000 people in a country with a population of only 35 million. In Alberta, the home of the University of Alberta, the oil and gas industry is even more important, and the current challenges are of grave concern to members of our community. The dramatic drop in oil prices over the last 2 years has resulted in the province experiencing major losses in royalty and tax revenues, and many people across the sector have lost their jobs. The government has had to take on significant debt to preserve public services and to stimulate economic diversification. Alberta's provincial government and Canada's federal government have the difficult challenge of securing agreements needed to build pipelines that will open up new markets for Alberta and Canada's oil. This is the result, in large part, due to the growing public resistance and concern, both real and perceived, about the environmental impacts of the industry. So Canada and Alberta face significant and complex challenges in an industry that is central to our prosperity. Here in India, the need is as great. perhaps greater, and the challenges are also extraordinarily significant. According to the International Energy Agency's India Energy Outlook, over the next 25 years, India will experience a rise in energy demand like no other country in the world. This increase in demand will be due to a number of factors: population growth, increasing urbanization as a predicted 315 million people move into cities, infrastructure development needed to enable that growth and urbanization, and a rising standard of living and increased consumer spending power for hundreds of millions of people. These factors, combined with India's policy commitment to achieving universal electricity access for all, means that India's power system will need to almost quadruple in size. By 2040, the International Energy Agency suggests about 50% of India's energy will be generated by huge expansion in coal generation, as well as imports and domestic sources of oil and gas. The other 50% will come from renewables, especially solar and wind. Getting to that predicted capacity, India will need to make trillion-dollar investments across the full energy system, from ensuring secure access to much-needed foreign supplies of oil and gas, to expanding new generation capacity for coal, hydro, nuclear, and renewables. At the same time, it will also be critical to strengthen the power grid and focus on building new infrastructure to the highest standards of energy efficiency and environmental sustainability. This hybrid prediction for India's future explains why today's topic, alternative energy beyond fossil fuels, is on second glance not unexpected at all. It is instead both timely and necessary at a conference like this. We now live in an age where we often speak of the energy industry rather than the petroleum or oil and gas industry. This change in language underscores that the global community is entering a period of transition, moving from a high dependency on hydrocarbons to lower carbon energy generation. As we know, a number of factors are driving this transition. The greatest, most pressing being climate change and the global commitments that my country, along with yours, have signed as part of the Paris Accord. Industry, universities, governments are being challenged to think differently about how we create and consume energy, and to include in our thinking the impact energy generation and consumption has on both the environment and the economies that fuel social and cultural prosperity. To manage the transition ahead, it is time to begin thinking in terms of energy systems rather than simply energy sources. Why? Because the complexity of the challenge we face demands that we do. Although we are in a period of transition, moving away from our heavy reliance on hydrocarbon energy generation, we will rely on these energy sources for decades to come. So it is critical that we not only continue but accelerate our work on reducing the environmental footprint of hydrocarbon energy generation, increasing efficiency, reducing waste, eliminating water use and tailings ponds, reclaiming land, and much, much more. At the same time, we also need to quickly increase the effectiveness and reliability of alternatives such as wind, solar, next-generation fuel cells, geothermal, biomass, and other biofuels. And, as always the case, deal with the extraordinary challenge of energy storage. Linked to that is the need for smart grid technologies that can manage and mitigate the major fluctuations in supply and output that go along with a hybrid of multiple alternative energy sources. In both India and Canada, we also face the problem of needing to effectively distribute energy to remote and underserviced communities. In conjunction with research and innovation on the supply and distribution end of the energy spectrum, We must also do more research on the impacts of energy production and consumption to both the environment, human health, community development, both urban and rural, and global geopolitical stability. What we learn from this research will, of course, circle back and have an impact on the research and innovation being done to reduce the impact of energy right at the point of production. Finally, there is the challenge of encouraging and creating public policies, government regulations, public and private investment, as well as both the tax regimes and incentives necessary to achieve these absolutely fundamental goals. And as we have learned in Canada, how the public feels about energy, the benefits and the risks can simply not be ignored. Public awareness and education is critical as we look forward to this transition. The challenge ahead is indeed complex. Approaching it as an energy system challenge should better lead to our understanding and how to affect decision-making going forward. Amit Kumar, a research chair in energy and environmental engineering at the University of Alberta, knows this well. He is one of only a handful of researchers working on techno-economic energy system assessment. The goal is to help decision makers evaluate which technologies can be used in which situations to greatest advantage. The University of Alberta is also taking this energy systems approach in a new research institution. Earlier this fall, we received $75 million to establish the Future Energy Systems Research Initiative. Our goal is to lead and facilitate research and innovation across the full energy spectrum. All of us here today face a major opportunity. We all have a role in creating change and innovation in the energy industry. As president of a large research university, my role is maximizing human talent and attracting the funding they need to succeed. Meeting future energy challenges will not only take visionary research investment, but also large-scale international collaborations and partnerships. With the Future Energy Systems Research Institute, we are excited about being able to build international multidisciplinary teams of researchers from engineering, science, nanotechnology, law, humanities, social sciences, agriculture, and business that will take a multifaceted global approach to energy. Where do I see the greatest potential for innovative new partnerships between the University of Alberta and the organizations that you lead and represent? Well, I see at least 4 areas. Number 1, clean coal and carbon capture sequestration. Through our Clean Coal, Carbon and Mineral Processing Technologies Center, there are opportunities to collaborate with more than 100 researchers on an area of research that is critical to the future prosperity of India and the health of our planet. Number 2, smart grids. The University of Alberta is home to one of North America's largest research clusters dedicated to smart grid technology, with a focus on the very challenges we will share in the integration of renewable energy sources, power conversion, cybersecurity, and weather forecasting. Number 3, waste into fuel. Whether we are talking about the waste from vegetable oils or animal fats or general household waste, our work is critical. Our biorefining conversions network is well on its way to turning Alberta's biomass into commercially viable fuels. Edmonton's Waste Management Center of Excellence has translated research discoveries into a 60% reduction in the waste being deposited in the city's landfill, and the goal is to achieve 90%. And finally, cheap, inexpensive solar cells. We have a major research initiative with our National Institute of Nanotechnology, and they have discovered a way to mass produce cheap, flexible solar cells. The team does this by spray coating composites of nanoparticles, which one day will result in solar panels being able to be sprayed on almost any surface. So, this is not a new message. The Global Academy and industry working together. We already know well the power of partnership. And the University of Alberta's partnerships with Petrotech and ITTs and universities across this country illustrate what can happen. By increasing our opportunities for partnership and exchange, we can speed the flow of discovery and change and begin to tackle the great challenges we face more effectively. I'm a biologist, so I know that diversity in any system breeds innovation and resilience. So let's take advantage of the diversity in the room here today. Together, we can enable more joint research projects, more joint degrees, and more collaboration. We can facilitate student exchanges between our nations and create new generations of leaders who think globally when attacking local problems. These are the opportunities ahead, and I look forward to working with you and realizing the tremendous potential that we have to inspire and lead change as we tackle one of the great global challenges today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Turpin. And let me now invite Mr. Surana to make his presentation.
Respected Chairman, Shri Anil Kakodkar, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. We have heard the important inputs from the previous speakers, and I will try to substantiate what has been said. Some of the things which are already covered, I will try to pass on for the sake of saving time. Fossil fuel has been the important ingredient of our total primary energy in last decades, or since last 4 or 5 decades, contributing to more than 80% of our total primary energy demand. The renewables, though it taken a shape, it continued to be less than 1%. And today we are faced with 2 important questions. One thing is the sustainability of the fossil fuels, and the second is the viability of the alternate fuels. And when we address ourselves to these 2 issues, and especially in the context of India, the issue becomes important further because 20% of our population do not have an access to energy as of today. Viability of the alternative fuels had been in the discussion because of the cost, though it has been reduced substantially, but still it continues to be a matter which affects the common masses to make it as a use item for the general public. Just to go back, the global energy mix was dominated by the fossil fuels, with the oil contributing around 33% of the total energy consumption. In the last few decades, there was a trend, but in 2015, for the first time after 15 consecutive years, the oil recorded a gain in the share in the primary energy mix. The current key global trends, if we see, there is a weakening in the energy demand, guided by the decline in the growth in China, slow recovery in Europe, and the shift of the fuel mix from coal to gas. There is an increased supply, notwithstanding the cuts which has been announced around 2 days back. Till we really understand the impact of it, the fact remains that it is an oversupplied market. There is a sharp fall in energy prices in last year or two, making the fossil fuels more cheaper. There is a growth in the non-fossil fuels, with China becoming the largest generation of the solar power, and there is substantial reduction in the technological cost for the wind and solar. In the last decades or 2 decades, the carbon emissions have recorded the slowest growth. Out of the primary energy consumption, 58% continues to be coal in India, while in the world it is around 28%, while oil is 33% versus 28%. As has been said earlier, we are a growing economy with the lowest of the energy consumption, and our per capita consumption is less than 1/5 or 1/4 as far as oil is concerned, and 1/10 as far as gas is concerned. With the various initiatives which the government of India has taken recently, there is an excellent possibility that the energy demand will increase, guided by Make in India program, which is likely to boost the industrial sector, the growth in the LPG etc. because of the schemes which are launched for the poor public, the boost which is being given in terms of construction, civil aviation, defense, financial services, infrastructure in terms of smart cities, renewal of the mid-town cities, transport sector, Sagarmala project, and gas being available as a viable alternative fuel in many sectors, and the opening up of the upstream sector. These are likely to drive the energy growth in India. As per various estimates available, whether IAE or BP or Niti Aayog, etc., one thing is common, that oil is going to record a CAGR growth of between 3.7 to 4.7, and gas between 4.8 to 5.5 in our total primary energy demands from now to 2030. And the major thrust on policy is to increase the share of renewables and gas in our own total energy basket. As far as India is concerned, between 2015 to 2030, the oil is continued to be the same, more or less 28 or 29%. The gas increases substantially from 7% to around 9%, and the renewable increases from around 2% to 6% or 7%. With coal reducing, but still continue to take a lion's share to around 51%. And with the global oil demand projected to grow at the rate of 0.8 to 1.1% per annum, India continues to be the third largest consumer of oil primary energy and may take over the other countries very soon. In this context and in this background, if we see what is the impact of the renewables on the total energy demand in India, a snapshot of the percentage CAGR growth of the various primary energy sources, it will say that the rapid growth is there in the renewables in the last 2 decades, while the growth in oil and natural gas, oil remaining more or less the similar, but the natural gas taking again a good share of the total growth. If we see the last decade's incremental energy share, it can be seen that 93% of the share has been taken again by the fossil fuels, and only 7% was contributed by the alternate energies or the renewable. An interesting fact is the time which is taken for the energy mix transition, and the factor is that how much time it is taken beyond 1% of the critical mass is reached. If we see, the renewables has taken 7 years to reach from 1% to 2%. The nuclear energy has taken 16% and it is at 1% level right now, while natural gas has taken 38 years to reach from 1% to 10%. And this shows that if we are today seeing or trying to see a future where there is a substantial shift in the energy mix, the history is to be seen, the time which is taken
Of course, today the time has changed and their rapid pace is being taken by the renewables in view of various alternative alternate reasonings like COPE, etc. The growing share of renewables in the power generation is from 7% for the remaining one, 10% from hydro and 3% from nuclear, but still 80% is from the coal and gas, which is the fossil fuel. The renewable led by solar and wind have increased to 13% and generating 7% of electricity as of today. And in the current context, the way we see today, the hydrocarbon fuels will continue to play an important role in India because of significant rise in the passenger cars, LPG witnessing a growth because of a specific policy thrust, industrial consumption of oil and gas to produce products, and then the gas demand to increase due to demand from the selected users like power generators, fertilizers, petrochemicals, etc. As far as transport sector is concerned, still the liquid fuels may demand the market. And therefore, if we just have a snapshot of the comparison in emerging and developing economies like India, where 250 million people are without energy access, the hydrocarbon fuels will continue to play an important role, while the renewables will show a higher share of the renewable and the fossil fuel, but still will remain the main source. The technologies to make the hydrocarbon fuel are shifting to a cleaner mode with the push in the industry that may make the fossil fuel less harmful, more sustainable. And there is a thrust from the government also to convert from leapfrog from BS4 to BS6 fuels and the use of gas, LPG, etc. And that may be a good complementing factor for the renewables. The intensity reduction of GDP which is committed by India is 33 to 35% by 2030, and the various factors which are being concentrated upon in India's roadmap to energy pathways is development of 25 solar parks, ultra mega solar power projects, canal top solar projects, and 1 lakh formal solar pumps to boost solar energy use. Renewable energy power targeted at 175 gigawatt by 2020, yielding around abatement of 326 million ton of carbon dioxide. 100 smart cities and new urban renewal missions of 500 cities, metros, metro rail, switched from BS4 straight to BS6 to improve the fuel standards across the country. Green highways with CNG and LNG running buses and transport vehicles, and the technology development for removal of global barriers and technologies. Around 500 megawatt power under wind is rightly under operation from the oil and gas companies in India, and another 250 megawatts are planned. In solar power, right now there is around 25 megawatt of power which is already under operation. An additional 100 megawatt capacity is being planned in next 4 years, and around 5,000 retail outlets are already solarized, and another 8,700 outlets are planned to be solarized soon. And the refinery side, in terms of emissions, liquid effluent, solid waste disposal, there are processes which are in place, and refineries have already invested around 90,000 crore in shifting from BS3 to BS4 fuels, and a substantial amount is going to be spent in the next 4 or 5 years to convert into BS6 fuels. The biofuel fuel program, already Mr. Pondrik has mentioned that sales of high-speed diesel blended with biodiesel is already in operation from around 2,200 outlets. Ethanol blending, which is currently at 4%, is to be taken to 10%. 12 locations, 2G ethanol plant based on this lignocellulose material are under implementation with an estimated investment of around 5,000 crores. And there is another plan to convert waste to fuel in around 5 or 6 states. Gas is going to be a game changer, and there is a specific focus on the same. The vehicles, though not yet popular, but there are the variants of the electric vehicles which are going to be coming, and Tesla's model, which has seen a logging of around 350,000 registrations right on the day of opening, which was more than all the registrations which they did so far, is an important factor. In conclusion, energy consumption in India is projected to be doubled with a CAGR growth of 4.6% per year. The energy mix is projected to change with renewable and gas, though oil share remains the maximum. The fossil fuel will continue to be around 84% of the total energy demand. Gas is seen to be increasingly used, but liquid fuels continue to be the dominant player in the transport sector. Among non-fossil fuels, renewables is projected to grow rapidly at around 11.7%. The degree of policy measures in carbon emission may see an entry of electric operated vehicles, and increased use of natural gas as a vehicle fuel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Surana. Let's move on to the next speaker, who is going to be Dr. Ajay Mathur. PPT लगा नहीं है.
Dr. Kakodkar, thank you very much. Also, many thanks to Petrotech for this opportunity. What I'd like to share is the kinds of challenges and opportunities that face India as it moves to meet the aspirations of all of its people. Obviously, the only paradigm that the world knows on how to live a better life is by providing more energy. We in India today supply about 0.6 tons of oil equivalent per person per year. As a rule of thumb, there's no country in the world which has a high quality of life, and I measure high quality of life as the Human Development Index of 0.9 or more, without supplying, as you will see from this graph, at least 4 tons of oil equivalent, 2.5 tons of oil equivalent per person per year. So just see the difference, 0.6 to 2.5. In other words, if we go up to the kinds of levels at which current countries have enjoyed a good life, the world would be fried, especially if it is met by fossil fuels. So the goal has to be to reach a good quality of life, but at lower energy use. Is that possible? Yes, it is. Because if we look at countries which have industrialized late, Japan and Korea being the best examples, they have been able to do it at much lower levels of energy supply than have those countries which industrialized earlier. In other words, you invest in infrastructure which is more energy efficient. So that's the first message that I'd like to leave with you. Energy and energy increase is essential if we want people to have a good quality of life. And investing in a new infrastructure that is energy efficient becomes the first step in moving in that direction. The second is that as we move to the future, we have seen a steady decline in the energy intensity of the Indian economy. So while the total amount of energy use has increased, the efficiency with which it is used, the efficiency measured with every rupee of GDP produced, the efficiency has also been increasing. The energy intensity, the opposite of efficiency, has been declining. This is because of many reasons. There's the structural shift which was mentioned earlier. Also because of the high prices of fuels in India, particularly when compared to people's incomes. Compared to people's incomes, prices of energy in India are amongst the highest in the world. We expect the energy intensity decline to continue, particularly as we invest more and more in energy efficient infrastructure. How does this happen? Let me give you one example. One of the largest users of energy in India is the industrial sector. And there's been a long-running debate on how do we make the industrial sector more efficient. When we looked at the industrial sector, we saw that in every sector, without fail, some of the industries were amongst the most energy efficient in the world. Well, then there's no problem. The problem is that in those same sectors, there were other industries which used 2 times, 3 times, 4 times as much energy to produce a ton of cement or steel or even in the electricity sector. So the problem, the policy problem that India faces in industry was one of diversity, one of bandwidth. There were some who were very efficient, but there were many others who were not. Consequently, what was introduced to address this was the Perform, Achieve and Trade program, in which industries, the 478 industries who accounted for about a third of the energy use, including the electricity generation sector, were all given targets to reduce the amount of energy that they use per ton of product or per kilowatt hour of electricity that they make, to be achieved in 3 years. And the target that was given was smaller for the guys who were already efficient and larger for those who were inefficient. This turned out to be quite a success. Targets were overachieved. There's also this option now that those who overachieve get their excess savings as certificates, which they can use either for the next phase or trade it with those who are not able to meet their own targets. This has now led to a second cycle in which more sectors have been included, refineries, railways, and the electricity distribution companies. So today it accounts for about 40% of the energy use in India. But what it tells you is that it is possible that the new infrastructure that is made can be made more and more efficient as we go along. Now, adding to all of this is the issue of climate change. What we have seen over the past few years is that whenever you look at newer technologies, they are more expensive, at least as far as first cost is concerned, compared to others that we use today. This is a challenge. And consequently, we have over the years maintained in our climate negotiations that unless we get technology and finance, we will not be able to make the jump towards a lower carbon economy. Nevertheless, what has happened in the last few years, the Perform, Achieve and Trade program that I talked to you about, or a rather innovative program to change all the lights in this country to LED bulbs, or in the renewables sector, where we have seen large price decreases occurring as we use the scale of our economy to build these programs. Coupling the scale with a process of growth has allowed new technologies to come in and prices to tumble as they have gone ahead. This, I believe, has given us the confidence that we can move ahead and manage the technology at a scale while also bringing down prices. So that's a positive thing which helped us, therefore, to see that the climate agreement is one which helps, which enables, which facilitates this kind of management of technologies so that you can reach scale while reducing prices. Paris, we believe, therefore, is a good thing because one, it allows us, instead of a top-down approach, it's an approach where each country says what is it that it can actually achieve. That's good, because then we are able to do those kinds of things which make sense to us for other developmental purposes. For example, invest in infrastructure that is more efficient, invest in renewable energy because it lowers our imports. We also agree that the Paris Agreement's goal of making transparency a requirement, because every country needs to know what it is doing, how can it do it better. As was mentioned, if you add up the commitments that all the countries made, they are not adequate. So we need to ratchet them up periodically. And therefore we agree that the Paris Agreement's ratcheting mechanism and the global stock take mechanism that would help this ratcheting to happen are an integral part of the world's approach. We also agree that this needs global partnerships. The International Solar Alliance is one example, the Mission Innovation is another. These kinds of partnerships would help bring in technology earlier and help prices come down faster. We believe that is the central goal of bringing together various countries to do actions simultaneously. So what is it that India has agreed? India has agreed, one, as was mentioned, that the carbon intensity of our economy, which is nothing but the amount of carbon dioxide we produce divided by the GDP, that this would decrease by 33 to 35% compared to what it was in 2005. Note that at our level of development, we are not saying that the carbon dioxide emission would decrease, but that as we develop, the amount of carbon dioxide that we produce per unit of development, per rupee of GDP would decrease. We have also said that in 2030, at least 40% of the generating capacity that we have, the electricity generating capacity, will come from renewables. We have also said that 2.5 billion tons per year of carbon dioxide would be fixed through forest and tree cover. Can we do this? Our belief is this can be done if three things are put into place. The first is lower the cost of capital for renewables. Mr. O'Sullivan had made the point about the declining trend in the price of renewables. If you look across the world, the cost of project implementation on renewables, and I'm sure Sumant will talk to it in a moment, is the lowest in India. Yet the price of renewables is not the lowest. What is the difference? The difference is the cost of capital. Because unlike coal or oil or gas, the entire cost of the project is in the capital cost. And if the cost of capital is high, that means that the cost of electricity from that is high as well. With interest rates of 11, 12, 13%, clearly these prices are high. We need, therefore, to see how we can reduce the cost of capital for renewables. The second is energy storage. Again, as the point was made, the more and more penetration of renewables we have, we face the problem of how will our energy needs be met when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. So whether it is pumped storage, whether it is peaking gas, whether it is batteries, we need to make sure that we get these into place and the prices decline as soon as possible. This can only happen if we can have business models that help aggregation on the one hand and payment over a longer term on the other hand. That's how we need to bring these together. So to end, what is it that we are doing? As I said, to enhance energy efficiency in the infrastructure that is going to be set up, there's a range of programs, whether it is enhancing the Perform, Achieve and Trade program to include refineries, electricity distribution companies and railways. Whether it is the launch of air conditioners. Air conditioners are today the single largest reason for the increase in electricity year on year. Approximately half of the increase in electricity from last year to this year is because of the air conditioners that were sold in this 1 year. And third, how do we bring this capacity of storage, of the ability to quickly bring in new electricity or back down electricity when renewables is available into the market? And that's the ancillary services market, which has now been working for the last 4 months or so. But there are also opportunities. The electrification of road transport has been talked about. You know, it's much easier to decarbonize the electricity market, much more difficult to decarbonize the fuel market. And therefore, if you can move transport to electricity, in the short term, we will be reducing oil imports. In the short term, we will be selling the electricity of which we have an excess capacity today, and in the longer term, we have the opportunity to convert it into renewables. Second, if energy storage is important, we need to create platforms where the renewable energy and the energy storage options together provide us the scale that is needed to bring prices down. Sir, it is my own belief that we stand at a crossroads in history. Today, we have got more capacity, electricity capacity than we need. We have got about 308 gigawatts. The maximum that we have sold is 156 gigawatts on the 8th of September this year. There's another 40 gigawatts which is under construction. In other words, this capacity is enough to meet our demands at least till 2022. Now, if by that time, the price of renewables plus the price of storage, the two of them together, can become equal to that of coal, say 5 rupees per kilowatt hour in the mid-2020s, then we have an option that as and when our current capacity meets the demand, the new capacity that would be added would be completely renewable. Sir, I think we have an opportunity, and I think we have the tools in place to meet that. Thank you very much.
So that's really going beyond fossil fuels. Let's move on to the next speaker, Mr. Sumant Sinha, to take the floor.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the organizers of Petrotech for inviting me to speak at this conference. As I was reflecting on the invitation to come and speak here, I realized, and as I was sitting here, I realized that I'm really like a little bit like a fish out of water, being a renewable energy company in a Petrotech conference. And as I was talking to my colleagues sitting on the dais and asking them, has Petrotech ever invited a renewable energy company to speak at its previous conferences? And I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, but it might very well be that this is actually a historic occasion in that I'm the first renewable energy company to be invited to speak at this event. And that to me actually speaks to the rising importance of renewables in the area of energy in general, and particularly in the area of electricity in specific. And I think Dr. Mathur made some very, very pertinent observations, and it's really very interesting to hear his insights into this, and certainly I would echo a lot of the things that he said. And as I do that, what I thought I'd do is actually, a lot of people have talked about the macro issues around renewables, the pricing of renewables, how it might become more relevant going forward. And I thought I'd give you a little bit of a more practical sense of what's happening in India right now, and how therefore, in fact, renewables might get implemented in the context of the policy environment that we have in India, and the practical constraints of implementing renewables. So this chart has been presented by various people in different forms, but very simply put, if you look at the chart on the right hand side, it shows that India's per capita power consumption is almost a fourth that of China's, and a 15th that of the US. And these are not numbers that are not known to anybody. These are things that are fairly clear. But I think to me it's just a little bit staggering that if you think about the fact that if we even talk about doubling our per capita consumption of power, we're talking about actually potentially increasing the 300 gigawatts, notwithstanding the lower generation that we're running at, to perhaps 600 gigawatts. And the decisions we take on adding the extra 300 gigawatts over the next several years will actually have very fundamental implications on how the whole issue of climate change, for example, pans out. And so therefore, the decisions that India now takes with regard to its energy philosophy going forward will have very far-reaching ramifications quite beyond, obviously, our own shores. These are again numbers that we've talked about. The Prime Minister himself talked about the fact that we need to increase our energy capacity by 3-4 times over the next several years. And really that's, I think, the challenge that is there for all of us operating in the power space right now. And what is the mix going to be going forward? So this really, the pie chart reflects the actual contribution right now of renewables and the entire composition of our power basket. Thermal still obviously is the biggest chunk, about 70%. Renewables is right now about 11% in capacity terms, but in natural generation terms, it's only about 6.5 to 7%. And so therefore, there is a fairly large play that we have to continue to grow this number. And if you look at the government's target of 175 gigawatts that has been set by the Prime Minister, that actually is taking us to a trajectory of about 17% of renewables in the grid by 2019. So that's a really, really ambitious target that has been set by the government. And the question is, are we in line to achieve those numbers, or are we at some point going to be falling short? But I think it's really, really remarkable that the government has set a target which is so large in the area of renewables. Now, the questions that arise therefore are, is there enough resource availability in India for achieving these targets and going beyond these numbers? And the second question is, how much is it going to cost us? Because if the cost is very high, then obviously adding any gigawatt of renewables is going to cost us that much extra money. And the other questions are around the fact, does our grid have the capability of handling so much power? And do our discoms have the financial wherewithal to buy all this power? I think those are the 4 or 5 biggest constraining factors that we have to address in the area of renewables. Now, if you look at some of the factors there is actually some good news and some not so good news. The good news is that as far as resource availability is concerned, we clearly have enough both wind and clearly we are a sunny country, so we all know that we have enough solar available as well. But just if you look at wind, and what is happening is as technologies are improving, hub heights for wind turbines are getting higher. So for example, the largest turbine that we've put up, or the highest turbine we've put up, is 120 meters high. Right? It's a combination of lattice and tubular tower, and 120 meters high is actually 1.5 times the size of Qutub Minar. So that tells you how big each one of these individual turbines has now become. And blade lengths are now becoming as long as about 55 to 60 meters. And transporting those over Indian roads and conditions, of course, is its own logistical problem, but is being done. And so therefore, at those hub heights, you can see that there is enough availability of wind energy. And very little of that so far has been tapped. In fact, only about 27 gigawatts out of 300 gigawatts that is at this point estimated to be there. Solar, of course, the story is even more different. In solar, you can put up pretty much a solar plant anywhere in India. And so even the 600 gigawatt number is really just a theoretical number. To me, there is sort of almost limitless capacity for solar in the country. And if you look at on the cost side, and I'm really talking about wind and solar more because they're the more mature renewable energy technologies. But if you look at on the cost side, the costs have come down so tremendously that it surprised even people like us who are operating in the sector. Now, if you look at just 3 years ago or 4 years ago, solar panels were selling at about $1 a watt. About a year ago, they were selling at about 50 cents a watt. Today, they're selling at about 35 cents a watt. And the people we have to thank for this remarkable reduction, apart from the technology companies that are working on improving technology, of course, is actually the Chinese panel manufacturers, and maybe by extension, the Chinese government. So just like Germany and Spain initially supported the adoption of renewables by buying very high cost and thereby bringing the cost down, I think at this point in time, it's really the Chinese companies that are subsidizing the uptake of solar in various parts of the world. And I think the point that Dr. Mathur made is very relevant. If you look at the prices that are being bid at for solar right now in the Middle East, where, by the way, radiation levels are very similar to what they are in India, the cost of the equipment is very similar to what it is in India. The actual costs there are about 3.5 cents now per kilowatt hour, which is arguably the lowest cost of any energy anywhere in the world. Right? Now, the difference only in India is the cost of capital. Our cost of capital is 11 or 12%. But if you could get that down to 5 or 6%, then it is very clear that we could also get solar energy in India today at 3 or 4 cents. And inevitably, that is going to happen in the next few years' time. Either capital cost is going to come down or equipment cost is going to come down. And you will see that the cost of solar, which today is about 7 cents in India, in most parts of India, is probably going to come down to 3 or 4 cents over the next 5-7 years' time. And that, to me, is going to cause a very, very fundamental revolution in the entire energy market in India. And that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out, of course. So this is the target the government has set, which is 175 gigawatts of solar by 2022, of renewables. Of that, the solar target is 100 gigawatts, which is broken down 60 for utility scale and 40 for rooftop. Given the fact that the rooftop installations put less load on the grid itself, and therefore have a bit of an advantage in that sense. And the target for wind is 60 gigawatts. And so far the government has actually done a lot of work to make sure that these targets are achieved. This year we'll cross 10 gigawatts very easily of installed capacity, and beyond that the government has already auctioned off another 15 gigawatts, which is meant to be installed over the next 10 to 12 months. And so therefore you can now start seeing capacity additions in solar of about 10 to 12 gigawatts every year, and of wind of about 4 to 5 gigawatts every year. And that, let me tell you, it's just a number, but actually it makes us probably the second or third largest market in the world for solar installations. China, of course, is at a different level at about 30 gigawatts every year in solar, but the US is number 2 right now with about 10 gigawatts. So if we hit 10 gigawatts, the reality is that we're going to be the second largest market for solar in the world. And that is why there's a lot of interest in the Indian renewable market among foreign investors, whether strategic or private equity or other financial investors. Because the reality of these targets being met is now beginning to, I think, become more real, and therefore people are now becoming a little bit more, looking at the market a little bit more seriously. Now, the government has already done a lot, as I said, and there's the Jawaharlal Nehru National Solar Mission, which the previous government had set a target of 20 gigawatts. This government increased that to 100 gigawatts. So there's a lot of work that is going on there. Actually, let me go to the next slide, which talks about some of the issues, the further constraints, which are really, number one, around the financial health of the distribution companies. Unfortunately, in India right now, all distribution is mostly in the hands of state-owned companies. These are very politically driven. Tariff setting is, again, done by regulators, but it's not necessarily in a way that allows distribution companies to get the right kind of returns. And so therefore the government implemented this year the Uday scheme, which is meant to restructure the financials of distribution companies, and that is happening. And hopefully this will actually be fundamental in turning around the distribution companies, which will then have the capacity to buy more renewables going forward. And as I said earlier, the reality is that because the subsidy element of renewables has come down so much, therefore there's not an extra burden on the distribution companies to actually buy renewables very significantly. And then of course the government has also put in place the National Clean Energy Fund, which is funded from a cess on coal, which also allows the government to come out with various schemes and programs that allow the cost to the DISCOMs to be lower than what they might otherwise have a difficult time in paying. And the government has set these RPO targets, which are the renewable purchase obligation targets, which ultimately force the distribution companies to buy renewables, more renewables going forward. And so therefore, I think that the DISCOM problem is solvable. I think the government has taken a lot of steps, and I think over the next 1 or 2 years, you'll probably find a lot of improvement happening in that area. The other thing, of course, is financing. As I said, if there is returns to be made, if there's scale to be had, you will find financing to come into the market. So on the financing side, I'm less worried. The other issue is the grid, and does the Indian grid have the ability to actually take so much renewable energy, which is intermittent in nature? And that's where what Dr. Mathur said becomes really relevant, which is the whole area of storage. And there's a lot of work globally going on in storage. I think as costs of storage come down, certainly we can start seeing much more uptake of renewables in the grid. Even otherwise, today we have only 7%. Countries like Denmark and Spain, through better management of the grid, have got renewables to go as high as over 50% in certain parts of the year. So it's not that 17% should cause us fundamental problems, but I think in uptake beyond that is something that can also be managed once storage becomes easier. And then, of course, there are lots of logistical issues to implement projects in India, not least of which is the issue of land acquisition and so on. And those, in some senses, provide natural barriers to the growth of renewables. So however bullish I am about renewables, the target is 175 gigawatts. Over the next 5 years, it will contribute in effective energy generation terms about half of that compared to conventional. So the reality is that for the growth in renewables beyond, in the overall energy markets beyond that, you do require more and more you'll have further growth in thermal as well, and you require gas for balancing the grid. I think that is really essential. So to me, all of these energy sources are going to coexist very well in the future. I think renewables might take a little bit more market share, but coming off a small base, it's probably going to grow the fastest among all the sources of energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha. Let's move on to the last presentation, and may I now invite Dr. Saraswat to make his presentation.
My thing? Yes, sir, I got it. Allow me time.
Good afternoon, Dr. Kakotkar, my fellow panelists. Change of sequence was warranted due to virus in the computer or my CD, and I didn't want to deprive you of the slides, otherwise it would have become a monologue. I'm going to talk to you about methanol economy. Basically, the idea came to me during my first meeting with Professor Ola, sometime about 7-8 years back. And he is the proponent of this economy, methanol economy. Many of you might have read his book. Certainly, the talk in this particular session is hinging around beyond the fossil fuels, and something in between I am talking about. Obviously, the reason is very clear that energy demands are there. You have heard about it, increasing world population, increase in the standard of living, demands are increasing, but the numbers which I just heard certainly gives me a feeling, is it really true what Dr. Mathur said? We have 300 and we are using only 100 and odd. Now these are numbers we need to reconcile, but the fact remains that there is a depleting oil situation, and increase is taking place of the fuels and all that. Resources are finite on the human scale, so there is going to be a problem. And of course, you have the problem of the global warming due to the excessive emissions. It certainly has an inflationary effect also, which is with respect to the price of the oil. So if you look at the energy security as a total conundrum, then you will realize that amount of oil and natural gas reserves are depleting, so alternate energy becomes a viable solution: hydro, wind, geothermal, solar. Among the renewables and the nuclear, hydrogen, ethanol, still so far people have been stopping at ethanol, and now we have added methanol there. Methanol, hydrogen and ethanol could be the sources of stored energy like fossil fuels, but reducing our dependence on import. Also potentially carbon dioxide can be recycled and to make methanol, so it becomes almost like a closed cycle system. So methanol economy certainly is a viable option as an intermediate to reaching the ultimate non-fossil fuel requirement, what we call as the hydrogen economy. Hydrogen economy, as it is lingering towards technology achievements, it is certainly having its own time. I remember having read about it 2032, the full-scale hydrogen economy, but all of us know that technologically we have problems of production, storage, transportation and thereon. So methanol becomes a very important and a very good fuel as a fuel as well as a feedstock for two reasons: because it is a drop-in fuel for gasoline because of the high octane number it has, the clean burning fuel it has. In terms of energy, for example, M85 is about 15.8 million joules per liter, and you have its derivative dimethyl ether, which is a high cetane fuel, clean burning, and a good replacement for LNG and LPG substitute. In addition to that, as a feedstock, and the way it is happening today, the methanol is a good feedstock for olefins and It's those who want to convert into gasoline and diesel and so forth. And then there is a thing which is coming is direct methanol fuel cells, which can directly solve the problem of storage of hydrogen and so on. Basically, the properties wise, it is a very clean system, excellent internal combustion engine fuel, because it is just a boiling point of about 64.7, has high octane number. M85 is a flex fuel which is being used like the ethanol 85, and many countries have already adopted right from M15. You might have heard recently Israel has standardized and even regulations have been issued for M15 as a methanol as a fuel for most of the vehicles. It can be blended into biodiesel through esterification and converted to dimethyl ether through a very easy process. Can be blended. So there are blendings possible between methanol, ethanol and gasoline, and those who are looking at how do you carry hydrogen, I think methanol is a good carrier of hydrogen at modest temperatures. There is no problem. If you look at its performance on the diesel engines, diesel-like efficiency and torque provides exceptional strong suppression of engine knock, higher allowed turbocharging pressure than the gasoline or natural gas, and if you have a spark ignition engine working on a methanol, it could provide around 1.5 times more torque per liter than diesel. And this has been done through the study in MIT, where you can see if you have working on high compression ratio, that itself gives you 10% increase in efficiency. If you have turbocharging with downsizing, you have about 30%, that means 20% increase, and if you are able to do the exhaust heat recovery, you are touching efficiencies of the order of 55%. So you are really in the realm of higher efficiency as far as the engine is concerned. There have been a lot of changes that have taken place, because in Europe when they introduced what we call as the stricter regulations on the sulfur dioxide emissions for a variety of marine applications, brought down from 10 ppm to 5 ppm. Instead of going for sulfur reduction towers and so on the ship, people started using methanol for the first initial moving away from the coast. And as a result, there are engines today. Stena Germanica is working with Wärtsilä engine with a total of about 32,000 horsepower working on this kind of a system. So there is a possibility that we can really use methanol for the marine applications also. There is another one which is coming, is a way to safe and clean cooking. As all of you know, a large number of people in the world today, even today about 3 billion people use biomass for cooking. That means inefficient way of cooking and also high pollution. So methanol is the perfect cooking fuel for consumers. It burns cleanly, leaving kitchens and homes smoke-free. Methanol can be easily produced in large quantities and from inexpensive materials, making it an affordable option for low-income consumers. There are already designs available where a canister can carry methanol and you can plug it in with your burner, and you can safely use it as a cooking fuel. Mostly in Africa, Kenya and Uganda, many places, developing nations, it has become the order. In fact, China is another one country which is using methanol for cooking in a big way. Cost-wise, it is certainly at the number 3. It's about 3.9 for gasoline, 4.3 for ethanol, and methanol is about $3. So you have cost advantage. Of course, it varies from region to region. The dimethyl ether, which is a very simple product from methanol through, as we call as dehydration process, which is another replacement or a substitute for LNG and LPG, and all of you know that we have more than 50% LPG being imported today in our country. So it is easy to produce, ship and dispense, and there are a number of trucks today working on. Volvo is selling DME trucks, and there are a number of trucks in Japan and Denmark already operational working on DME. There is yet another application for methanol, which is powered by reforming methanol. You can get a PEM kind of a fuel cell running. So you have methanol reforming catalyst, then you get hydrogen and carbon dioxide, proton exchange membrane, and you get the electricity. Basically, the reforming is also easy because it's a single carbon-carbon bond, where you can do the reforming process at lower temperature of the region of 250 to 300 degrees and avoids problem of onboard storage of hydrogen. So this is another method. Only the size of the reformer if we can control, that would be easy for all mobility systems. Direct methanol fuel cell is yet another thing which is coming in, where you can have methanol 5 kilowatt hours per liter. Theoretically, it's almost twice the hydrogen system. So it is very pure, no pollutants. Direct reaction of methanol eliminates reforming and capable of startup and operation at 26 degrees centigrade and below. And the feeding is no gas. You have only liquid to be fed. So you have got smart fuel cells in Germany which are already existing for low power. The main problem here is the cost of the catalyst at the moment, because it is platinum and ruthenium. That if that can be brought down, I think it will be a very good solution as far as the e-mobility is concerned. How do you produce methanol? That's more important, because the way the world over people are doing today, what India should do, that is the question. So there are various industrial methods like syngas, like from coal gas or natural gas or any of them. Direct methane conversion, biomass gasification. There was a talk on biomass. I think India is the right place where you can convert biomass into methanol wherever you have methanol kind of an application. Second thing is, of course, carbon dioxide itself can be converted into methanol. Besides that, originally it used to be from wood, because it was the wood as the alcohol. So the global production of methanol is about 40 million tons per year, most of which is produced from natural gas and oil. However, high prices and limited reserves of natural gas in certain geographical areas, particularly China and Africa, have stimulated interest in the unconventional feedstock for the production of methanol. So China has embarked on a huge percentage of methanol production coming in from coal. India certainly has a very large reserve of coal which can be certainly used, and not only large reserve, our poor quality of the coal, which high ash content, can be used for conversion into methanol, because no thermal power plant is willing to take that as a feedstock. So there is a utilization available through the gasification technology. The process becomes very simple. It is whether it's a natural gas or petcoke or coal or petroleum residues or biomass. Basically, either you go through the reformation process or gasification process to create syngas, and after that it is methanol synthesis to create methanol, or DME synthesis to make DME, or Fischer-Tropsch for getting all the liquids. Basic thing is you can get power, you can get hydrogen, and you can also get a feedstock, chemical feedstock for this. Methanol from carbon dioxide, which is a simple process with using very, very cheap catalysts like copper and zinc oxide, which can convert, and you can, all the static installations where it is easy to capture carbon dioxide, this could be a process. China has done it in a big way. Energy demand as well as the security from the energy point of view have driven them that 50% of the global demand and capacity is being met from methanol. Second thing is growing demand of key petrochemicals in China, basically MTO, that is methanol to olefins and methanol to gasoline. These are all driving them to go to higher and higher percentage of methanol being used from coal. More than about 30 to 40 plants producing large quantity of methanol are working today. You have the growth taking place almost at the region of about 23% annually, and about 19% in China it is already taking place. There are 37 standards promulgated already in China, and by 2014 more than 1500 refueling stations have been put in use. 43 blending facilities are already in position. Indian situation here is, currently we have about 1.5 million tons of consumption. We produce only about 0.385, and demand is about 2.5, so we are importing almost about 2.0. So closed cycle it is, that you have carbon dioxide coming from this and carbon dioxide recycled, so there is practically an economy which can leave minimum footprint. Opportunities for India, we have a program where Prime Minister has announced 10% import dependence to be reduced of oil and gas by 2022. Methanol can be used as an alternative transportation fuel. Government can use under the clean cooking fuel program the replacement of LPG, and the cooking fuel could be methanol. A large number of telecom towers, especially in rural areas, run on diesel for 16 to 20 hours. DME provides a substitute for replacing diesel in telecom towers, and biomass MSW to methanol, a viable option for India, can be dovetailed with Swachh Bharat mission, help India with its climate change diplomacy in international forum. So there are some immediate applications, conversion of captive diesel generator based on power plants to dual fuel system, water transportation, which is inland waterways which we are going to develop, procurement of either flexi fuel boat with up to 100% methanol or conversion of the existing boat. For Indian Railways, multiple pilot projects should be taken up to immediately start with dual fuel conversion of existing diesel locomotives with DME or methanol applications. Cook stoves, I mentioned to you, is a very good solution for rural areas where the supply of LPG is even today a problem. So this is the pathway, and that's the economy we can drive along with the energy security philosophy of our country. So methanol is the answer, friends. Let us go for it. Thank you.
Well, distinguished delegates, we have come to nearly the end of the session. I am conscious of the fact that we are half an hour behind time, not essentially because of delays in this session. I think everybody has done within a minute of their allotted time, but we started late. But even so, I won't take much time, but please allow me to do my duty assigned. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate the organizers, as was made, an observation was made by one of the earlier speakers. I think having a session on beyond fossil fuel in a professional body dedicated to petrochemical is, I think, remarkable, and I think we should congratulate the organizers for shaping this session. Secondly, I think we should also be conscious about the point which has been made by the panel, and that is the transitions in energy do take time. Even if technology is all ready, it still takes time, and so the transition in energy is a long duration endeavor. And so I think we should be absolutely sure about our long-term path. There cannot be too much of a flip-flop which can cost the country very dearly. Let me also use this occasion to just quickly recap some of the points made by the panel, and then I'll come back to some of my own observations. I think a point about reducing imports. We are today almost all of hydrocarbon, a good part, a reasonable part of coal we import. In primary energy term, I think the import stands at around 43% of our total energy use, and there is clearly a need to keep the import bill in check, because the energy requirements are going up, and so also the import of fossil energy in fact would spiral up. That is inevitable, but at the same time I think there is a need to cut on imports, and so the call for 10% reduction in import is an important one, and we did hear from Mr. Poundrik the strategy to do that in the form of use of biofuels, maybe biodiesel or ethanol or second generation ethanol. The next important point that I'd like to bring about, as has been made by speakers, is in terms of as we made transition to the next generation non-fossil energy situation, we have to take cognizance of what's happening, but we have to also take into account what's likely to happen as we move forward, and particularly this issue of having to deal with a lot of variable generation in the grid and the need for call it adding extra battery capacity, extra smartness in the grid and so on and so forth. And I think we need to keep that under track and be ready to make sure that our grid systems remain stable as they should be. The policy drive for higher energy efficiency is an important thing, and I think it's clear that India has done well on this front, and I am sure that there will be greater achievements in years to come. Finally, if you talk about India of tomorrow, we need to recognize, and that point was also made, that you have to look at India differently than the rest of the world in terms of the evolution of its energy system, simply because Indian situation is very different. We are a country which is an energy hungry country. The need for additional energy in India is perhaps the largest as compared to any other country in the world, and that plus the profile of the consumption pattern, the profile of users in India is quite different, and I think Indian strategy needs to adjust or needs to be organized to meet that reality. Now, since we are talking about beyond fossil fuels, let me take you to something like 50 or 60 years and beyond. Imagine the level of energy use. A point was made that today we are probably 1/4 or 1/5 of a desirable energy use to support a good human development index that we would like to see. So imagine the level of energy consumption of that kind, and then look at the sustainability of resources, energy resources, particularly those available on Indian landmass. And I think a simple back of envelope calculation will tell you that the long-term sustainability of energy sources in India is in fact in only two things, solar and thorium. And I think we need to quickly move. Thankfully, the government policies are very supportive of moving in this direction. But I think it's important that recognizing that the energy transitions take time, we define a non-fossil energy mission, and or if we talk in terms of economy, I would suggest, in contrast to what Dr. Saraswat talked about, methanol economy, let's aim at moving towards non-fossil energy economy, because that, I think, is the important thing. Now, in the context of such an objective, what is it that we need to do? According to me, there are 4 pillars, and I'm going to talk about them very quickly. Number 1, which is already happening, I think we must deploy very rapidly all available non-fossil energy technologies. And we have seen that happening in the context of solar, in the context of wind, and I'm sure even nuclear would pick up and grow rapidly very soon now. In the context of the reducing import dependence, and that point was also made, that in addition to the efforts being taken in terms of biofuel, because that's an important way to reduce import dependence, I think we must recognize that the electric mobility, electric transportation is also an important, because of the total energy that we use, particularly the primary energy that we use, I think something like 20% goes to transportation. And if that transportation shifts in a major way from hydrocarbon to electric mobility, it's clearly going to manifest itself in a very large reduction in the import of energy, apart from promising a cleaner transport. Now, whether we are talking about electric transport or we are talking about large renewable energy in the grid, the key is battery. And so development of energy storage, batteries, is a matter, according to me, of a very crucial importance. And we must do everything possible, do it ourselves, collaborate with others, encourage or challenge companies of the world to do this. But I think that's a very important way to make transition beyond the fossil energy, and more particularly also the short-term need of reduction in terms of the energy import. Having said that, the next part is about a very quick deployment of the technologies for conversion of non-fossil energy into energy forms that we want to use. Now you would notice most of the renewable energy, except biofuel of course, the output is in the form of electricity. Whereas in terms of usage, we of course need electricity, but we also need fluid fuels. And so I think we need technologies where you start with renewable or nuclear and translate to the fluid fuels which can be used. So it amounts to getting towards synthetic fuel. Now I think we have in our refinery industry the core competence to carry out this chemical transformation. It's only the front end where you must release this primary energy at high temperature and produce hydrogen from water. And then of course you use carbon dioxide, you use coal, you use biomass, but then using these inputs, sort of convert these inputs into the fuel forms that we use in our transportation sector. And I think there is a very important need in terms of moving towards these technologies. I also mentioned about the need to import or minimize imports. And of course, certainly methanol is an important route to do that. I think all technologies to convert coal to liquid, I think we must look at them seriously and certainly adopt wherever there is opportunity. The last point that I wish to make is, of course, we have talked about recycling of carbon dioxide, but I think we also need to look at the biotechnological route. For example, algae are an important source for sequestration of carbon dioxide. Today the rate is rather low, so it's not very attractive. Can we, through genetic modification, create new species where the CO2 absorption rate can go up by a factor of 10, say? And I think that could be transformative. And I think we must challenge our biotechnology community to help us do that. So friends, I thought I'll add some of these points because this session was to look at beyond fossil fuel. I must thank all my colleagues on the panel who have very ably brought out important issues, both in terms of moving beyond, but also more importantly, the near-term problems in terms of making transition. And of course, I must thank all of you for staying on in spite of the fact that we are well into the lunchtime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your very keen observation and insights and very constructive views and suggestions towards moving to cleaner energy, and thanking all our panelists also for sharing their research work and the other potential sources of energy, which, as we've always said, it's now going to be a mixed basket of energy, exploring these other sources of energy. Thank you to all our panelists. May I request all of you to please step forward for a group photograph, and then we close the session. Thank you.